The night was cold, colder than Mark had expected. He had just finished his shift at the auto shop, his hands calloused from the day's labor, and was heading home to his wife and kids. The streets were almost empty, the city wrapped in a thick blanket of snow, with the occasional vehicle passing by. Mark liked it that way, quiet, peaceful, a break from the chaos of work. He pulled his jacket tighter around him as he walked down the narrow sidewalk, the chill cutting through the layers of his clothing. Mark wasn't the type to get into trouble. He was an ordinary guy, a mechanic, doing his best to provide for his family. He didn't cause waves, didn't attract attention. But that night, something was about to change. As he turned a corner near an old diner, two police officers in dark uniforms suddenly appeared, their flashlights sweeping across the street. One of them, a younger officer with a stern face, quickly approached Mark, blocking his path. The other officer, older with graying hair and a hardened expression, stood back, observing the interaction from a distance. "Hey there," the younger officer said, his tone colder than the wind that howled through the street. "You seem like you're out here all alone. What's your business?" Mark paused, a little taken aback. He had seen police officers around the area before, but they'd never paid him much attention. "Just heading home," he replied, a little confused. "Long day at work." "Aha," the officer said, narrowing his eyes. "You sure about that? You don't look like you're just heading home." Mark's heart rate picked up slightly. Something didn't feel right, but he remained calm. "I'm sure. Just finished at the shop. I live a few blocks down." The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced over to his partner, who was now slowly approaching, giving Mark a look that felt more like a predator sizing up its prey. "You've been walking around here a little too long," the officer continued, his voice now carrying an edge. "You got any ID?" Mark felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. He had done nothing wrong. He wasn't a criminal, but the officer's attitude was making him feel like one. He nodded and reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his wallet. As he handed over his ID, the officer took it with an air of disdain, scanning it quickly before tossing it back into Mark's hands. "I don't know, man," the officer said, glancing at his partner again. "Something about this just doesn't feel right." Mark's pulse quickened. The officer's tone was changing, becoming more accusatory. "I'm just trying to get home, that's all," Mark said, his voice steady but beginning to feel the pressure of the situation. "Yeah, we'll see about that," the younger officer said with a smirk. "You're going to do a little test for us." Before Mark could ask what he meant, the older officer spoke up. "Get down and do some push-ups," he ordered. The words came out so casually, like it was just another part of their routine. Mark froze, disbelief creeping up his spine. "What?" he asked, trying to process what was happening. He was just a regular guy trying to get home from work. Why were they doing this? The younger officer raised an eyebrow. "You heard him. Push-ups, or else we'll have to take you in." A knot formed in Mark's stomach. He couldn't understand why this was happening. Was it some kind of joke? But there was nothing in the officers' faces that suggested they were joking. They were serious, and the more he hesitated, the more hostile their body language became. Mark stood there, his mind racing. He could try to argue, but that might make things worse. He had no idea what they were capable of, or how far they would push him. They were both bigger than him, and Mark wasn't exactly in top physical condition. Still, he wasn't about to let them walk all over him. He glanced around, looking for any kind of escape, but the street was deserted. No one was there to help. He had no choice. He dropped to the ground and began doing push-ups, the cold biting through his thin jacket as he lowered himself to the pavement. The snow around him began to accumulate on his back, adding to the pain. Each push-up felt like a punishment, the freezing air stinging his skin with every movement. His arms burned, his chest ached, but he couldn't stop. Not yet. Not if he didn't want things to escalate. As he pushed himself up and down, He noticed the younger officer filming him with a phone. Mark's face flushed with anger, humiliation, and a sense of helplessness. They were enjoying this, the way they watched him struggle, the way they made a spectacle of his discomfort. The older officer smirked, arms crossed, as if he were watching some sort of game. Mark's breathing was heavy now, the cold making it harder to catch his breath. His arms were shaking, his muscles screaming for rest, but he kept going, forcing himself to push through the pain. He knew that if he stopped, if he showed any sign of weakness, they'd make things worse. And so he pushed on, the humiliating laughter of the officers echoing in his ears. After what felt like an eternity, Mark finally finished the required number of push-ups. His body was exhausted, his skin red from the cold and exertion. He stood up shakily, wiping the sweat and snow off his face, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The officers, seemingly satisfied, nodded and told him he was free to go. They didn't apologize. They didn't offer any explanation. They just turned and walked away, leaving Mark standing there, feeling smaller than he had ever felt in his life. As he watched them walk off into the night, Mark felt something deep inside him shift. It wasn't just the physical pain that lingered. It was the humiliation, the injustice. He had been treated like an animal, and he knew he couldn't let it slide. Not this time. Something was going to change, and Mark knew that he couldn't walk away from this without making them pay for what they had done. This wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The cold wind seemed to bite even harder as Mark walked the rest of the way home, his mind swirling with a mixture of disbelief, anger, and humiliation. He couldn't shake the image of the officers, their smug faces as they watched him struggle in the freezing cold. His body ached, every muscle protesting against the unnatural positions he had been forced into, but it wasn't the physical pain that lingered. It was the sting of what had just happened, how those two men, sworn to uphold the law, had used their power to break him down, to make him feel less than human. As Mark trudged through the snow-covered streets, he replayed the event over and over in his head. What had gone wrong? He had been minding his own business, just trying to get home. Yet somehow, in the blink of an eye, he had become the target of a twisted power game. His pride had been crushed, and for a moment, he had felt completely powerless. He hadn't done anything wrong. He wasn't a criminal, but in the eyes of those officers, he had been nothing more than a tool to be used, to be humiliated. When he finally reached his house, his wife Sarah was waiting by the door. She was always the first to notice when something was off. She looked at him with concern in her eyes as he stepped inside, his jacket caked in snow, his face flushed from the cold and the effort. "Mark, what happened?" she asked, her voice gentle but full of worry. Mark didn't respond right away. He hung his jacket on the coat rack and took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "It's nothing," he said at last, but the words felt hollow as soon as they left his mouth. He didn't want to burden Sarah with this, not yet. Not until he knew what to do with it. But Sarah could tell something was wrong. She stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Mark, what happened?" she asked again, this time with a firmness that told him she wasn't going to let it go. Mark looked into her eyes and, for the first time, allowed himself to feel the weight of everything that had happened. The humiliation, the helplessness, the frustration. It all poured out of him in a rush. "Two cops. They made me do push-ups in the snow," he said, his voice strained. "They humiliated me, Sarah, in front of God and everyone." Her eyes widened in shock, and she took a step back. "What? Why? What did you do?" "I didn't do anything." Mark's voice cracked as he spoke. "I was just walking home. They stopped me, asked for ID. And then, they made me do push-ups, in the freezing cold, like I was some kind of criminal." Sarah's expression shifted from shock to disbelief, and then to anger. "That's ridiculous. They can't just do that. It's not right." "I know," Mark muttered, running a hand through his hair. I don't know what happened, Sarah. One minute, I'm just a guy walking home from work, and the next, I'm on the ground in the snow, doing push-ups for them. They recorded it, Sarah. They filmed me." She was quiet for a moment, processing what he had said. "We need to do something about this," she finally said, her voice resolute. "This isn't right. You can't just let them get away with it." Mark shook his head. "I don't know, Sarah. I don't know what I can do. They're cops. They have all the power. Who's going to believe me?" "We'll find a way," Sarah said, taking his hand. "You're not alone in this. We'll figure it out." But as Mark lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something bigger, about standing up for himself, about reclaiming his dignity, about making sure that those officers understood they couldn't get away with what they had done. The more he thought about it, the more the anger inside him grew. He had been humiliated, yes. But what bothered him most was the feeling that they thought they could do whatever they wanted to him without consequence. They had crossed a line, and now Mark had to make them pay. In the days that followed, Mark's mind was consumed with thoughts of revenge. He didn't tell Sarah what was going through his head. He couldn't. She would never understand. He didn't want to worry her, didn't want to bring that kind of darkness into their home. But he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let this go. The humiliation had to be avenged. Mark began to pay closer attention to the police officers who had treated him so poorly. He'd seen them around town before, but now they felt different, like enemies. He started to learn their routines. He noticed the younger officer often went to the same bar after his shifts, always with a couple of his fellow officers. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Mark knew that if he was going to make them pay, he needed to understand their weaknesses, their patterns. He started asking around, talking to the people he knew in the town, trying to piece together information about the officers' lives. Slowly, he began to gather little bits and pieces, nothing that would be immediately useful, but enough to make him believe that there was a way in. In the meantime, Mark started to distance himself from the community. He didn't go out much. He didn't talk to people as much as he used to. It wasn't because he was scared, but because he was angry. The quiet streets, the familiar faces, everything that had once felt safe and comforting now seemed tainted. Mark was becoming a different person, someone consumed by the need for vengeance. The more he plotted, the more his sense of justice solidified. He wasn't going to be the victim anymore. He was going to make those cops pay for what they had done. And when it was all over, Mark knew that things would never be the same again, not for him, and not for anyone who had witnessed the way he had been treated. But deep down, Mark also knew there would be no going back. This path he was walking down, the one he had chosen in the aftermath of that cold night, would change him forever. Whether it was for better or worse, only time would tell. But for now, he was focused on one thing, revenge, and nothing would stop him. For the first time in his life, Mark felt like a man on a mission. The days following his humiliating encounter with the two officers had been filled with a quiet rage that seemed to grow with each passing hour. Every time he saw a police car, every time he walked past the station, his fists clenched involuntarily. The town felt different now. The streets that once offered comfort now seemed to remind him of his powerlessness. But that was all about to change. It wasn't just about the humiliation anymore. It was about making a stand, reclaiming what was rightfully his dignity, his sense of justice. He was no longer the meek, ordinary man who just kept his head down and did his job. No, he was something different now. He was a man who had been wronged, a man who would make sure the ones who wronged him paid. Over the next few weeks, Mark started to gather information. Every day after work, he would walk the streets, blending in with the crowd, making casual observations about the police officers he had come to resent. He knew the younger officer, Officer Daniels, wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed. He had seen Daniels at the local bar a few times before, talking loudly and boasting about his career in law enforcement. Mark also learned that Daniels was a regular at a small, somewhat seedy dive bar on the outskirts of town. Mark took note of the hours Daniels worked, his habits, and when he was most likely to be in the bar. Mark had a few friends who worked at local businesses, and after a bit of casual conversation, he learned that Daniels often drank alone after his shifts. The older officer, a man named Sergeant Harris, was a more distant figure. He didn't socialize as much as Daniels, but Mark knew from the few times he had seen him around that Harris was a man who valued his reputation, something that could easily be tarnished. Armed with this knowledge, Mark began to put together a plan. It wasn't a plan of brute force. No, Mark was smarter than that. He knew that going after them directly could cause even more trouble, especially given their positions as law enforcement officers. He needed a more subtle approach, a way to expose them for what they had done without them ever suspecting it was him. Mark began to stake out the bar. It wasn't the kind of place he usually frequented, but he had been there a few times, enough to blend in without raising suspicion. The first few nights, he sat in the dimly lit corner, nursing a beer and watching. His eyes always gravitated toward the same spot, toward Officer Daniels, who seemed to be the more reckless of the two. Daniels would sit at the bar, bragging about his power, making crude jokes with other patrons. Mark could see the arrogance in his eyes, the entitlement that seemed to flow from him like it was second nature. Mark's stomach turned every time Daniels raised his voice, his laughter ringing out in the quiet of the bar. It didn't take long before Mark noticed something that caught his attention. One evening, as he watched from across the room, he saw Officer Daniels argue with a man at the bar. The confrontation was brief, but the way Daniels handled it, aggressive, dismissive, like the man didn't even deserve respect, struck Mark. It wasn't just the officer's words, it was his posture, his demeanor. Mark realized that Daniels had no regard for anyone he considered beneath him. It reminded Mark of the way the officer had treated him that cold night, and suddenly, a surge of determination ran through him. This was the opening he had been looking for. That night, Mark followed Daniels out of the bar. He didn't get close. He wasn't foolish. He kept his distance, just enough to stay unnoticed. But he made sure to remember the path Daniels took as he walked home. It was the same route Mark had walked many times before. There was a narrow alleyway near the police station that seemed to be a shortcut, a place where the officer would likely cut through in the dark. Mark's mind worked quickly, weighing his options. It was risky, but the idea started to take shape. If he could catch Daniels alone, away from his colleagues, maybe he could find a way to expose the officer's darker side. As days passed, Mark continued to refine his plan. He started showing up at the bar more frequently, just enough to get a sense of when Daniels would be there and when he would leave. Each time, he took mental notes, marking the officer's routine. Mark wasn't the type to make rash decisions, and he knew that if he was going to make his move, it had to be carefully calculated. Daniels was the weaker link, and Mark was certain that, with the right approach, he could push him into making a mistake that would expose his true nature. But Mark's plan was only half of the equation. He couldn't do this alone, and he knew he needed to get information on Sergeant Harris. The older officer was more elusive, more disciplined, but Mark was certain that Harris had his own weaknesses. Everyone did. So, Mark began digging deeper, talking to people who had crossed paths with Harris over the years. He learned that Harris had a family, a wife and 2 children, and that he had been in town for a long time, respected by many, but also feared by a select few. The more Mark learned, the more he understood how crucial it was to bring Harris down without directly confronting him. If Harris' reputation was tarnished, if there was enough pressure, the system would do the rest. By the time Mark had gathered all the information he needed, he was ready. The plan was set. He knew that Daniels and Harris would eventually cross paths, and when they did, Mark would be waiting. He didn't want to hurt anyone, but he couldn't let these officers get away with what they had done. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. Mark had been humiliated, but that wasn't the real issue. The real issue was the system that allowed men like Daniels and Harris to behave with impunity. If Mark could bring them down, he could make a statement that would reverberate throughout the town. It was his way of fighting back, his way of telling the world that there were consequences for abuse of power. The anger that had driven him in the days after the incident had morphed into something colder, more calculated. Mark wasn't just reacting anymore. He was taking control. He was the one making the decisions now, and nothing was going to stop him from seeing this through. It wasn't about the push-ups anymore. It wasn't about the freezing cold. It was about something far bigger. And Mark knew that when the dust settled, the town would never be the same again. The night of the confrontation had arrived. Mark felt a surge of adrenaline as he stepped into the dimly lit bar, his eyes scanning the room for Officer Daniels. His heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't let it show. He had done everything right so far, and now it was time to put the final pieces of his plan into motion. His hands were steady as he walked toward the bar, taking his usual seat in the corner where he could see everything without drawing attention to himself. The familiar smells of stale beer and fried food filled the air, but tonight it wasn't about the atmosphere. It was about the mission. Mark had been observing Daniels for weeks now, and he had learned a lot. The officer was predictable, a creature of habit. He always came to the bar after his shift, ordering the same drink, sitting at the same spot at the bar. His guard was always down, a combination of alcohol and arrogance making him an easy target. Mark wasn't there to fight him. He wasn't even there to confront him directly. No, Mark had learned how to use the officer's own behavior against him. He would expose Daniels for what he truly was, and once the officer's flaws were laid bare, there would be no turning back. It didn't take long before Daniels walked in, the familiar swagger in his step as he approached the bar. Mark stayed still, waiting for the moment to come. The officer greeted the bartender with a half-smile and a slurred greeting. Mark couldn't help but feel a sense of disdain as he watched the man settle in at his usual place. Tonight was the night. Mark knew that Daniels wouldn't suspect a thing. He was too confident, too cocky, to see what was about to happen. As the night wore on, Mark kept his distance, watching Daniels carefully. The officer was getting louder now, his laughter filling the bar as he told some ridiculous story to the few patrons nearby. Mark made his move when the bar was a little quieter, when Daniels was leaning back in his chair, his eyes half closed from the alcohol. Mark slipped from his seat and made his way to the restroom, taking a deep breath as he stepped inside. He had a hidden camera on him, small enough to be concealed beneath his jacket. It wasn't illegal to record someone in a public space, especially when they were behaving as Daniels had been. But Mark knew this footage would be crucial. He had to make sure that everything he was doing was documented, because this wouldn't just be about revenge. It was about exposing the truth, about showing the world the ugly side of someone who had gotten too comfortable in their position of power. Mark made sure the camera was on and hidden securely as he stepped out of the restroom and moved toward the back of the bar, where Daniels had been sitting. He knew the officer had a few bad habits, but it was one in particular that Mark had been waiting to capture. Daniels had been harassing a woman a few nights ago. Nothing physical, but his words were sharp and mean, like a man who had been given too much control and now didn't know how to handle it. Mark had witnessed it from a distance and had decided that this would be the moment to catch him in the act. He approached the officer from behind, keeping a low profile as he adjusted the camera, making sure it was pointing directly at Daniels. The plan was simple. Mark needed to catch Daniels in a moment of aggression, something that would show everyone exactly who the officer really was. He wasn't just a man who made a mistake with Mark that night. He was someone who abused his power regularly, someone who treated the public with contempt. And Mark had the perfect setup. It didn't take long before the opportunity came. Daniels, a little more drunk than usual, started getting rowdy. He stood up, swaying slightly, and began shouting at the bartender for a refill. As Mark watched, he saw the officer's eyes lock onto a young woman sitting at the far end of the bar, a woman who was clearly trying to enjoy her night alone. Mark could see her tense up as Daniels approached, his breath heavy with alcohol. Mark's heart raced as he saw the officer lean in, saying something in a tone that was clearly meant to intimidate, but the woman didn't flinch. Instead, she stood up, her face a mixture of disgust and defiance. She calmly turned away, but the officer wasn't done. "Hey, don't walk away from me," Daniels shouted, a slur in his words, his hand reaching out to grab her arm. That was the moment Mark had been waiting for. He pressed the button on his camera, capturing the whole exchange. The woman yanked her arm away, her voice rising in anger as she told the officer to leave her alone. Daniels didn't take kindly to the rejection. He stepped forward, his posture growing more aggressive, the rage in his eyes building. Mark could see it. The officer's temper was flaring. The man was out of control. The scene played out for a few more moments, with Daniels leaning in closer, shouting at the woman, calling her names. The bartender stepped in at that point, trying to separate them, but Daniels pushed the bartender away with a rough shove. That was when Mark made his move. He moved quickly toward the exit, ensuring the camera was still running as he exited the bar, leaving the chaos behind. But he knew this moment, this exchange, was going to be the one that brought Daniels down. As Mark walked through the dark streets, he felt a strange sense of satisfaction. He had done it. He had captured the officer's true nature on film, and there was no way Daniels could deny it now. The video, once it hit social media, would spread like wildfire. People would see what kind of man he really was, and there would be no hiding from it. It wasn't just about Daniels anymore. It was about all the people like him who used their power to terrorize others. Mark was about to pull the rug out from under the system that allowed men like Daniels to act with impunity. The next morning, Mark didn't waste any time. He uploaded the video online, making sure to keep it anonymous. He knew the consequences could be severe, but he also knew he was doing the right thing. As soon as the video began to circulate, the reactions came flooding in. Comments from people who had witnessed similar behavior from the officer, people who were tired of living in fear. The video went viral quickly, and soon enough, local news stations picked it up. The story spread across town, and the backlash against Daniels and his actions was swift. Within hours, Daniels was called into the police station for an internal review. The video had done its job. He was under scrutiny now, and there was no turning back. But Mark wasn't done. He knew that the moment Daniels fell, the attention would shift to Sergeant Harris. And Mark had something planned for him too. He wasn't going to stop until both of these officers, these symbols of abuse, were held accountable. It wasn't enough to expose Daniels. It wasn't enough to show the world what he had done. Mark was going to make sure this entire system, one built on pride, power, and corruption, came crashing down. But as the phone calls and messages flooded in, Mark couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his stomach. He had achieved his goal, but was it worth it? As his actions spiraled out of control, he realized that revenge was a dangerous path, one that could leave more destruction in its wake than he ever intended. For the first time, he began to question everything. The days that followed Mark's decision to post the video were a whirlwind of unexpected consequences. At first, there was a rush of exhilaration, the kind of satisfaction that only comes when you know you've done something big, something that will have lasting effects. The video had gone viral almost immediately. Social media was flooded with people calling for Daniels' resignation, his colleagues voicing their disappointment, and the community divided between those who praised Mark for exposing the officer and those who believed it was an overstep. But as the days wore on, Mark started to realize that things were spiraling out of control in ways he hadn't anticipated. The first phone call came the next morning. Mark was still groggy from a restless night, his mind racing with the aftermath of the video's release. He'd barely gotten any sleep, his thoughts consumed by the reactions he had seen online. His phone buzzed, the screen flashing an unfamiliar number. He answered it cautiously. "Mark," a deep voice said on the other end. Mark's stomach tightened. "Yes." "This is Detective Thomas from the local precinct." The voice continued. "We need to talk." Mark's heart skipped a beat. His breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected this so soon. "What about?" he asked, trying to sound casual, though his voice wavered. "The video. We've seen it," the detective said. "We're conducting an internal investigation into Officer Daniels' conduct. But we also need to speak with you. Come down to the station." The weight of the words hit Mark like a ton of bricks. He had known that this moment would come. The fallout from exposing Daniels was inevitable, but hearing it from a detective's voice made it all the more real. Mark's gut twisted as he realized that his actions, while exposing the truth, were now catching the attention of the very system he had tried to bring down. He wasn't just an observer anymore. He was part of the story, a key figure in the investigation. But as much as he wanted to argue, to back out, to pretend this wasn't happening, Mark knew he had no choice. He had opened this door, and now it was too late to close it. That afternoon, Mark walked into the station. The walls, once comforting and familiar, now felt like they were closing in around him. He had always been a law-abiding citizen, someone who never sought confrontation, never pushed the boundaries. But now he was in the belly of the beast, surrounded by the very system he had exposed for being flawed. Detective Thomas was waiting for him in a small, sterile room, his expression stern but not unfriendly. "You've caused quite a stir, Mark," Detective Thomas said, his tone even. "That video. Well, it's all over the place now. You've made it impossible for Daniels to cover up what he did, but there's a bigger issue at play here. You've put the whole department under scrutiny, and we need to understand your role in this." Mark sat down across from the detective, his palms sweating despite the cool air in the room. "I didn't mean for all of this to happen," he began, his voice low. When I saw what Daniels did, it felt wrong. I had to do something." Thomas leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "And you think posting that video was the only way to handle it? You're lucky this hasn't blown up even further. You've put yourself in a very dangerous position, Mark. There are people who aren't happy with your actions. And I'm not just talking about the officers. You've made enemies." Mark swallowed hard. He had known there would be consequences, but he hadn't anticipated the way everything would unfold. "I did what I thought was right," he said quietly. "But now, I don't know if it was worth it. I never wanted to cause this much chaos." Detective Thomas regarded him for a long moment. "You did the right thing, Mark. But there's a price for doing the right thing. And now you need to be prepared for that. Daniels might have been the face of the problem. But there's more to this than just one bad officer. This goes deeper, and we need to know how far you've gone to get this footage. We're not saying you're in trouble, but you need to understand that this investigation involves a lot more than you might think." Mark's head spun. He hadn't realized how deep the corruption ran, how much was at stake. All he had wanted was justice. Now he was in the midst of something far bigger than he could have ever imagined. He had gone after Daniels to expose him for his actions, but now he was tangled up in an investigation that could change everything about his life. The officer wasn't the only one who would pay the price. Mark had crossed a line, and now it felt like the whole town was watching to see how it would play out. By the time Mark left the precinct, his mind was a mess of confusion and doubt. The detective's words echoed in his head. "You've made enemies." Those words were not just an idle threat. Mark could feel it. The town was turning on him, or at least some of it was. He had done what he thought was right, but now it felt like there was no going back. His family was already beginning to feel the strain. Sarah had been supportive at first, but even she was starting to show signs of worry, her phone buzzing with messages, the whispers of the town seeping into their lives. The next day, Mark was at work when the phone rang again. This time, it was his employer. "Mark, we need to talk," said Dave, his boss, his voice tight. "I've had a few calls from the higher-ups. There's some pressure on us now, from the department, and from others. They're saying that this is a conflict of interest, and I need you to come in and explain yourself." The words stung, But Mark had expected them. He had known that it was only a matter of time before the pressure would reach his work. "I understand," he said quietly. "I'll be in as soon as I can." When he arrived, the tension in the office was palpable. Dave sat behind his desk, his face drawn and serious. "I don't know what you were thinking, Mark. But now, the whole company's in jeopardy. We've got officers who are furious with you. I don't want to lose business because of this, but I need to know where you stand. You can't keep doing this." Mark sat there, the weight of it all crashing down on him. His reputation, his livelihood, his family, all were on the line now. This wasn't the simple act of standing up for what was right anymore. It was a battle that he wasn't sure he was prepared for. He had thought exposing Daniels would be the end of it, but now he realized it was just the beginning. The fallout was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. As the days went on, Mark felt the walls close in. He had exposed a corrupt officer, yes, but now he was the one under investigation. The town was divided. Some saw him as a hero, others as a troublemaker. The tension in the community was palpable, and Mark couldn't escape it. He tried to focus on his family, on Sarah, but even she could sense the change in him. The man who had once been content to live a quiet life was now embroiled in a fight that was bigger than he could handle. And yet, despite the mounting pressure, despite the fear and the uncertainty, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he had done the right thing. He had exposed the truth, no matter the cost. But now, as he sat at home late one night, staring at the phone in his hand, he wondered if it had been worth it. The officers, the community, his family, all of it had been thrown into turmoil. Mark wasn't sure how this would all end, but he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. He had made his choice, and now he had to live with the consequences. The weeks that followed Mark's decision to expose Officer Daniels felt like a slow-motion unraveling of everything he had once known. The investigation, which seemed like the only logical step at first, had grown into something bigger, something far more complex. Mark had expected some backlash, but he hadn't anticipated the intensity of the scrutiny. The fallout had become personal, his life more entangled in the very web of corruption he had sought to expose. Each passing day felt like a new challenge, one that left him questioning whether his actions were worth the cost. Mark's employer had given him an ultimatum, and the tension between them had reached its breaking point. The business had lost contracts, and some of his colleagues, who had once been his friends, began distancing themselves. The whispers around town had turned into open judgment. People who once looked at him with respect now eyed him with suspicion. Some in the community still supported him, calling him a hero, but the louder voices were those who saw him as a troublemaker, someone who had disrupted the status quo. His family, too, was beginning to show signs of strain. Sarah, his wife, had been supportive at first, standing by him as he took on the challenge of bringing the officers to justice. But as the pressure mounted, she started to withdraw, unsure of how much more they could bear. Mark could see it in her eyes. The worry, the exhaustion. She didn't want to lose him to this fight, but she could feel him slipping away, consumed by the same anger and frustration that had pushed him to take the video in the first place. Their dinner table had become a place of silence, where the once lively conversations now felt forced and tense. The kids, too, were affected. Their friends at school were hearing the rumors, and it was only a matter of time before the taunts and whispers reached their ears. Mark had tried to shield them from it, but he knew it was inevitable. His choices had consequences, not just for him, but for everyone in his family, and that weight was beginning to break him. The final blow came when the news broke that Daniels had been officially suspended, but not for the reasons Mark had hoped. The department had issued a statement saying that the video posted online was taken out of context and that Daniels' behavior was a misunderstanding. There would be no formal charges pressed. It was a slap in the face, a clear message that the system was more interested in protecting one of their own than seeking justice. Mark felt the anger surge again, but this time, it was different. He had been fighting for justice, for accountability, but now it felt like the system had won. He had exposed one officer's misconduct, but the machine had swallowed him whole, spitting out a watered-down version of justice that didn't satisfy anyone's need for real change. The town's attention had shifted away from the problem, and the officers, particularly Sergeant Harris, were slowly starting to rebuild their reputations, unscathed by the media storm Mark had ignited. At first, Mark thought about continuing the fight. He considered going public again, pushing harder, demanding more. But each time he imagined it, the weight of his family's struggles, the loss of his job, the constant stress of living in a divided town, made him pause. His resolve was wearing thin. He had put everything on the line for a cause that now felt far too big to take on alone. He was only one man, and the more he fought, the more it seemed like the walls were closing in. One quiet evening, as Mark sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind the trees, he realized something. The fight had changed him, and in ways he hadn't anticipated. It had taken more from him than he was willing to give. His family had paid a price. His job, once his pride and joy, was slipping through his fingers. His sense of self, that quiet dignity he had clung to all his life, was now a shadow of what it had been. He had wanted to make a difference, but now he wondered if the difference he had made was worth the cost. Sarah came outside and sat beside him, her presence a quiet comfort. The cool evening air stirred, and for a moment they sat in silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Mark," she said, her hand gently resting on his, "I know you did what you thought was right. But at what point do you stop? When does it end?" Mark turned to her, his face etched with weariness. "I don't know," he admitted. "I thought I could make a difference. I thought I could fix it, you know. But now, I feel like I'm just losing everything." She nodded, her eyes reflecting a mixture of sadness and understanding. "You've already made a difference, Mark. You've shown people who those officers really are. You've exposed something that needed to be exposed. But sometimes doing the right thing doesn't mean you have to destroy yourself in the process." Her words hit him harder than anything else. He had been so focused on the fight, so consumed with the idea of justice, that he hadn't stopped to consider the toll it was taking on him, on his family, on everything he held dear. The town might not have gotten the kind of justice he had hoped for, but he realized, slowly, that there was still a chance to salvage what mattered most: his family, his peace of mind, his dignity. Over the next few weeks, Mark began to withdraw from the conflict. He stopped responding to calls from reporters, stopped reading the comments online. He focused on his family, on rebuilding the relationships that had been strained. Sarah had been right. He had already made a difference, even if it hadn't been the kind of grand, sweeping change he had imagined. What mattered now was finding a way to heal, to move forward, without continuing to burn himself out in a fight that seemed never-ending. Mark never forgot the lesson he learned: that justice doesn't always come in the way we expect, and that sometimes the most important battle is the one you fight to preserve your own peace. The officers who had wronged him would eventually face the consequences of their actions, but Mark had realized that it wasn't his responsibility to bring them to their knees. His responsibility now was to his family, to his own life, and to the future he could still build with them. The town would move on, the officers would move on, and so would Mark. He had exposed the truth, and while it hadn't been the perfect victory he had imagined, it had still been a victory. In the end, he found peace in knowing that even small victories mattered, that his actions had sparked change, even if that change hadn't been immediate or dramatic. The fight had transformed him, yes, but so had the quiet moments of reflection, of rebuilding what had been broken. And that, Mark realized, was the real victory all along.